Good day to all. This will be our third part about discussions on debt and debt crisis with sovereign debt or foreign debt. First is the importance of debt structure. Debt denominated in foreign currency or short maturity debt or short-term debt is associated with lower credit ratings, sudden stops, higher volatility. If we recall with the ratings, depending though on the sources like S&P a while ago, for items with lower credit ratings, meaning they are riskier as compared with the others, but also they have chances of higher returns. Overall, they have higher volatilities or volatility, limited ability of conducting monetary policy with the usage of interest rates and with impacts on money supply, and contractionary devaluations, like the devaluations would expand or contract that much. An appropriate debt structure can be made so that we can reduce the risk of defaults. Then, how do we make debt safer? So we can make use of new and safer instruments like using local currency or contingent debt instruments. For example, would be GDP index bonds, wherein the values would depend upon the performance of an economy with respect to the gross domestic product. By the way, we mentioned about GDP in the previous parts, but we haven't like mentioned the overall meaning of that one. Anyway, that's gross domestic product. Commodity linked bonds, like the values of bonds would depend upon the values of certain commodities, could be agricultural, could be manufacturing products and the likes. In fact, in US, there is an active market for commodities, but not all states though. Catastrophe bonds, like the bonds would, of course, derive its value depending on calamities or catastrophes. Also, the dollarized official lending. So lending can be based on other currencies, not just dollars. Why do we need official intervention? Because market can fail, could be critical mass, could be standards, and instruments cannot be patented. Like the financial instruments can be used by those even by privately contracting parties. Then in a political economy, short-sighted politicians may under-insure themselves about that. Then let's go now to what to do during that crisis. Well, this was a while ago, and going back to the outline, what to do now during that crisis, we can do fiscal consolidation, which means that the instinctive or based on instinct, the response would be to a debt crisis is almost always we need a fiscal adjustment. So almost always we have to adjust fiscal matters. This is like the response with the instinct, hence instinctive response, quite a mouthful. This does not make much sense if the debt crisis is not rooted in fiscal problems. That's true. As said a while ago, any debt failure is not necessarily because or due to or in connection to fiscal policies. We actually mentioned that already. And then that's the reality versus the theory that says they're connected. In fact, it may hurt not only in the short run, but also in the long run. I like these parts here because of much learnings. Recessions led or will lead to a permanent output loss, the loss that cannot be removed anymore. Once it's there, it's there. Although it would depend upon the loss if it is related to a financial asset that is not yet sold, that is still paper loss or not yet realized. Next is the adjustment variable is public investment. So the general public can invest so as to help the economy then. As said again, the adjustment variable is public investment. And we can see that here. So this is an interesting graph showing again two sides close to origin, the positive amounts and the negative change in primary current expenditures. And that's x-axis, by the way. Then change in capital expenditures for the y. So basically current, meaning that's short term, a year or less, capital would benefit more than one period. This is for Latin America and the Caribbean, and there's a change in capital and primary current expenditures during fiscal adjustment periods of 1990 to 2003. Weighted averages of percents or percentages of gross domestic product. So this is quite, of course, a disturbing graph, I would say that initially, but of course, if we get the thought of this, then we can appreciate this particular graph. It seemed to be very busy though. Then we can see the concentration with the red and with the yellow green or close to that color. There seem to be a lot of colors in our discussions for debt and debt crisis, but let me just make use of that color by then, like the name of that color. And this is very bad for growth and for the fiscal adjustment. When growth promoting spending is cut so much that the present value of future government revenues falls by more than the immediate improvement in the cash deficit, fiscal adjustment becomes like walking up the down escalator. So meaning, just imagine the challenge of an escalator that is going down and we would like to go up. So it doesn't go together. The thought of this is that the growth promoting spending, we do not spend. Remember, there is multiplier effect in spending. The more that we spend, the more that the economy can benefit, especially with the multiplier effect. So if that is cut, then the revenue would fall. For example, by more than the improvement in the cash deficit. So deficit is again when our budget for revenues would be lower than our budget for expenditures or cash expenses, even the actual ones, not just the budgeted ones. So in that case, supposedly there should be sort of having the debt or borrowing of money. But because we would like to limit our spending, so we cut. In that case, of course, when the present value of the revenues, meaning the benefits, should be lower than the minuses, which should be the immediate improvement in the cash deficit. And in that case, that's negative for the economy. What can the international community do? Don't ask for fiscal contractions if fiscal profligacy was not the problem. So we have to define terms here. What we mean by profligacy, that stands for excessive extravagance or excessive spending. If the spending, like the excessive one, is not the problem, then we should not contract the fiscal policies, like we prevent the spending. If a fiscal contraction is needed, don't front load it. So in other words, do not put it in the front or highlight it that much. Think about fiscal targets that protect investment. Also think about the quality of the public investment. Now, when is a fiscal contraction needed? Think hard about the math. We're now again looking into the math. This is the multiple equilibria, high I and low I. The international community can help, especially when the global I is very low. So if there is that I, the index in the global community is low, others can help. Don't lend at punitive interest rates, like interest rates that would punish us just in case there are defaults, then don't lend. Do not let others borrow. Beige Hot or Beige Hot was right for banking crisis, but he might be wrong for sovereign debt crisis. As said, sovereign debt does not necessarily follow the banking matters. Moral hazard is often overstated. So the morality and the hazards of that, the concerns of that, could sometimes be just overly estimated or overly thought about. That would have impact instead on our matters of debt and banking and would result to crisis. Then next facts would be how to deal with defaults or defaults from earlier this particular session. So again, here are our theories versus realities. So countries borrow in bad times, instead in good times. If ever countries default in good times, that would be strategic defaults. And so if anything, they default too much because of this strategy. However, in reality, during the bad times, countries would really default, and that would be justified, and sometimes too late to be justified because it has been defaulting a lot of times already. Now, defaults are very bad for the economy with long lasting negative consequences. That's our theory, but in reality, they do not seem to have. So the question now is, this is a nagging item, to default or not to default. Let me start by saying that, of course, our source here is not saying that countries should default more often. So we should limit. That would affect, again, the reputation and there can be more costs. But the author would like to ask, why is there this disconnect between theory and reality? The theory might be wrong, or they may be problem with the world. That's the sad thing. The author thought that this is due to a mix of political failure and a lousy international financial architecture, like the economy in terms of policy and in terms of system in financial matters. They're basically weak. Is the world wrong? This is a nice question. In a well-working system, countries should be able to borrow when they need funds. That is in bad times. But during bad times, our markets and sources would not be willing to provide credit at a reasonable interest rate. So they can be charging more. Therefore, countries borrow in good times because this is when they have access to credit. Because normally, and of course, this is based on real life also, we will be allowed to borrow money if our credit standing would also be good or great. If you're having bad times, then we might not be able to secure credit. And same reason why Willie Sutton robbed banks, because of the story that Willie Sutton made the robbery since he cannot borrow, especially money during the bad times. And of course, we're talking here about money. Unfortunately, sometimes they borrow too much in good times. And because of that, because they can borrow, borrow, and borrow, since the credit standing is good, and that will become a problem in the future. This behavior sows the seeds of future crisis. We mentioned this in part 2. We need to fix the political economy of debt. And again, the case of Sutton. Strategic or justified? Most of the defaults you observe are justified or unavoidable, at least exposed episodes after the fact have been or has been established. Now, strategic defaults are very, very, very rare. Take note of that. 3 superlatives or expletives. So very, very, very. So we cannot use econometric methods to access and to assess the cost of these very rare events. And what we are actually assessing is just the cost of non-strategic defaults. We said a while ago that in good times, theoretically speaking, though, this is again based on theory that a lot of economies would be defaulting even during the good times. That's a theory. So we are going to look into the default wherein it's non-strategic. So basically the company or the entity or the economy now, because this is all about business, is actually, of course, also as a whole, like the economy as a whole, but we can still connect to business as well since they're the same, that they are actually experiencing bad times. That's why they are defaulting. But why strategic defaults are rare? Because they are costly. That's the explanation. But what is the cost? So, of course, there can be a lot of cost as mentioned in our part 2. And then could be also non-financial costs. The current system is inefficient. It brings some pain. So we can see the length of that restructuring delays that can happen. It's longer for low income and then would decrease from low income to low middle and upper middle. Upper middle can do the debt restructuring in earlier times. But little gain, change in indebtedness to private creditors following debt restructuring. So we can see number of individuals or cases here. The ratio of debt or GNI post-default to pre-default. So we can see that here that there's just little advantage of the change in indebtedness. And we might be asking, is this inefficient system efficient? Some pain and no gain might be inefficient ex post after the fact has been established, but could be efficient before that fact is established. Some pain and no gain. That is inefficient. To have gain, there is pain, supposedly. High costs of defaults are necessary to create willingness to pay, establish credibility, and lower borrowing costs. So in that case, you would not default because you'll be paying more. This is why countries suboptimally delay default because they think of the additional cost to be paid. And this is why some borrowing countries are opposed to the creation of a mechanism that may eliminate these inefficiencies because it's still working, and it's supposedly to benefit all, but the borrowers may also benefit from this. And interestingly, from second best to first best, this is clearly a second best solution. Countries suffer, they destroy value and decrease recovery rates because of the delays or defaults of payments. Then this is an alternative story. The international community and financial markets implicitly forgive countries that default out of necessity, but would impose a harsh punishment on countries that default strategically. That's true. If the delay is really because of financial difficulties, then they can forgive implicitly, so not as expressed. If this is the case, policymakers need to signal that the default is indeed unavoidable and not strategic. And a way of doing this is to go through considerable pain in order to delay the default as long as possible. So plan also is needed. Also second best, but in this case, there is a solution. Solution, the first best could be achieved with the creation of a body with the ability to assess whether a default was indeed unavoidable. Like here, so in this case, policymakers need to signal others. So that's why, by the way, that's second item under an alternative story. Then the first best again could be achieved if ever there's a body that would assess whether a default was indeed unavoidable, because that would be forgivable. And a bankruptcy court for sovereigns, for the countries, by increasing potential recovery rates, it could be efficient both before the fact and after the fact has been established. And everybody, lenders and borrowers, is better off. And here's a source or background of our discussions. Then thank you very much for listening, and God bless us all always. Hopefully you learned something from our series this time.